The sun hung over Redemption Creek like a brass coin in a dead man's eye, baking the dust of the main street into a pale, choking powder. Heat shimmered off the packed earth, distorting the shapes of the raw lumber storefronts and the half-finished railroad station at the edge of town. It was a place caught between the memory of what it was and the promise of what it was supposed to become. A promise that smelled of creosote sawdust and the cold metallic scent of greed. Wyatt Cololton felt the town's tension in his bones. He dismounted in front of the Redemption Bank and Trust, the leather of his saddle creaking in protest. At 42, his face was a map of hard miles and harder fights, the lines around his eyes carved by the unforgiving Texas sun and the ghosts of his past. He had come to town for a simple purpose, to deposit the earnings from a cattle sale money that represented another year of sweat and solitude, wrested from the unforgiving land of his Double C ranch. It was a ritual of survival, a small victory against a world that seemed determined to grind men like him into the dust. He tied his horse to the hitching post, his movements economical and precise, a holdover from his years as a Texas Ranger. As he straightened up, his hand brushed against the small lump in his waistcoat pocket. He instinctively pulled it out, a silver locket tarnished with age, but polished smooth by the constant touch of his thumb. Inside was a miniature portrait of his wife, Sarah, her smile a faint, beautiful echo from a life that felt a lifetime away. He clicked it shut, the sound a soft, familiar comfort, and slipped it back into his pocket before pushing through the bank's swinging doors. The air inside was stale thick with the smell of paper ink and nervous sweat. A single teller, a young man with a thin mustache and an ill-fitting suit, counted bills behind a brass grill. Two other customers, a rancher and his wife, stood at the counter, their conversation a low murmur. Wyatt took his place in line, his gaze sweeping the room out of habit. The quiet was wrong. It wasn't the calm of a sleepy afternoon. It was the heavy, breathless silence that comes before a storm. The storm broke with the splintering crash of the front doors being kicked open. 4 men burst in their faces, obscured by bandanas, their hands filled with iron. They moved with a brutal, practiced efficiency that spoke of violence as a trade. Panic erupted. The rancher's wife screamed, a sound cut short as one of the men backhanded her across the face. "Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt," the leader barked, his voice a low, gravelly snarl that carried an unnerving edge of amusement. Wyatt's body went rigid, his ranger instincts screaming. He subtly shifted his weight, his hand inching toward the Colt Peacemaker, holstered at his hip. But he was out in the open, outnumbered. A foolish move would only get civilians killed. He held his ground, his eyes narrowed, cataloging the men, their weapons, their positions. The leader strode to the center of the room. He was taller than the others, with a cruel confidence in his posture. He ripped the bandana from his face, revealing the sneering, handsome features of Jackson Hayes, Blackwood's chief enforcer. This wasn't a simple robbery. It was a message. "Well, look what we have here." Hayes set his cold eyes, locking onto Wyatt. "Wyatt Cololton, just the man I wanted to see." He gestured with his pistol toward the teller. "The money, son, all of it, and be quick about it." The terrified teller scrambled to fill a canvas sack. Hayes never took his eyes off Wyatt. His smile was a thin, predatory slash. "Mr. Blackwood sends his regards. He finds your stubbornness tiresome." Wyatt remained silent, his expression a mask of granite. Hayes's presence confirmed what he already knew. The ambushes, the poisoned wells, the accidents plaguing the small ranchers, they all traced back to one man, Carter Blackwood, the railroad baron, who saw this land not as a home, but as a line on a map to be conquered. The teller pushed the sack of money across the counter. One of Hayes's men grabbed it. But Hayes held up a hand, stopping him. Not yet. We're not finished. He walked slowly toward Wyatt, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The air crackled with menace. You see, Wyatt, it's not about the money today. It's about teaching a lesson. It's about showing this whole pathetic town what happens when you stand in the way of progress. As Hayes passed him, he deliberately shoved Wyatt a hard, calculated blow to the shoulder. Wyatt stumbled, bracing himself against the counter. The silver locket dislodged from his pocket slipped free and fell to the floor with a soft, metallic clink. It lay between them, the polished silver gleaming against the dusty floorboards. Time seemed to slow. Wyatt's gaze fixed on the locket, his breath catching in his throat. It was the last piece of her he had, the only thing that hadn't been taken by the fever that claimed her 10 years ago. Hayes followed his gaze, and a look of malicious understanding dawned on his face. He let out a low chuckle. What's this, a little trinket? He reached down, but Wyatt moved faster, lunging for it. One of Hayes's men slammed the butt of his rifle into Wyatt's back, driving him to his knees with a grunt of pain. Hayes picked up the locket, dangling it from his fingers. He clicked it open, studying the tiny portrait within. Pretty woman. A shame. His voice was laced with a feigned sympathy that was more insulting than any curse. Don't, Wyatt rasped the word torn from his throat. That's not yours to touch. Hayes's smile widened. Everything in this valley will soon belong to Mr. Blackwood Cololton. Your land, your water, even your memories. With a final contemptuous look, he dropped the locket to the floor. Then slowly, deliberately, he raised his boot and brought the heel down with a sickening crunch of metal and glass. The sound was small, but to Wyatt it was as loud as a cannon blast. It echoed in the sudden, horrified silence of the bank, a sound that broke something deep inside him. Hayes ground his heel into the shattered remains, twisting it back and forth. Progress has a price, he said softly, his voice a venomous whisper, meant only for Wyatt. And you and everyone like you will pay it. He turned and strode toward the door. Let's go, boys. Our work here is done. His men backed out after him, their guns still trained on the frozen occupants of the bank. The moment they were gone, the rancher rushed to his stunned wife. The teller slumped against the wall, shaking. But Wyatt didn't move. He remained on his knees, staring at the crushed, twisted piece of silver on the floor. The face of his beloved Sarah was gone, obliterated under the heel of a man who killed for sport and profit. The conflict was no longer about land or water or a railroad. It was no longer a dispute between a rancher and a baron. In that moment, kneeling in the dust and debris of his most sacred memory, a cold, unquenchable rage was forged within Wyatt Cololton. It was a promise of retribution, silent and absolute. Jackson Hayes had just signed his own death warrant, and Carter Blackwood had just started a war he could not possibly understand. Wyatt finally moved his hands, trembling as he gathered the broken pieces of the locket. He closed his fist around the sharp, ruined edges, welcoming the pain as the metal cut into his palm. It was a physical anchor for the storm of fury and grief raging inside him. He rose to his feet, his face unreadable, his eyes as hard and cold as winter stone. He didn't need to say a word. Everyone in the bank could feel it. The quiet man who had just wanted to make a deposit had been replaced by the ranger he once was, a man who knew better than most how to finish a fight. The ride back to the Double C was a blur of sun-scorched earth and shimmering horizons. The setting sun bled across the sky, painting the mesas in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, while the wind whispered through canyons carved by time and sorrow. For Wyatt, the landscape was a reflection of his own soul, vast, empty, and haunted. His ranch was a solitary outpost against the immensity of the plains. The two-story farmhouse, built with his own hands from timber he'd hauled himself, stood like a weathered monument to a dream of peace that had never quite materialized. After Sarah's death, the silence of the house had become a living thing, a constant companion. He'd left the Rangers not long after trading his badge for a branding iron, hoping the relentless physical labor of a rancher's life could exhaust the ghosts that walked with him. But some ghosts refused to rest. Inside, he lit a kerosene lamp, from the flame chasing the shadows into the corners. He placed the shattered pieces of the locket on the rough-hewn mantelpiece, the mangled silver, a stark accusation against the wood. The house was exactly as Sarah had left it. Her rocking chair was still by the hearth, a half-finished piece of needlepoint still in its basket beside it. For 10 years, he had preserved this place as a shrine, but now, looking at the broken locket, he realized it had also become his prison. Blackwood's railroad was the physical manifestation of the modern world encroaching on his sanctuary. For months, its presence had been a low rumble on the horizon. Survey stakes driven into the earth like daggers had appeared on his neighbor's lands. The Johnsons, a family who had ranched the valley for 2 generations, had been burned out. Their deaths ruled as suicide and an accident. The Millers had sold for pennies on the dollar after their cattle were mysteriously poisoned. Wyatt had refused Blackwood's offers, knowing that selling his land would be the final betrayal of the life he and Sarah had planned to build here. Hayes's brutal display in the bank was Blackwood's answer to his defiance. It was a declaration that the time for offers was over. Wyatt's past gnawed at him. He'd been a good ranger, one of the best. He could track a man across bare rock and read a trail where others saw nothing. But his final year had been marred by a single catastrophic mistake. A pursuit of the notorious Dolan gang had ended in a chaotic shootout in a small border town. In the crossfire, a stray bullet, he never knew whose, but it didn't matter, had struck and killed an innocent boy, a teenager caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The boy's father, a merchant, had looked at Wyatt with an expression of such hollow, bottomless hatred that it had shattered Wyatt's faith in the law he served. He had turned in his badge the next day, unable to bear the weight of a justice that could cost so much. Now Blackwood's aggression was dredging up that old buried guilt, the feeling of being responsible for a destruction he couldn't control. A sound from outside broke his reverie, the frantic whinny of his horse in the corral. It wasn't the sound of a predator, but of fear. Wyatt grabbed his Winchester from its rack by the door, his movements fluid and instinctive. He moved onto the porch, melting into the deep shadows cast by the rising moon. The air was still too still. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets and coyotes had fallen silent. He scanned the darkness, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of his property. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement near the barn. Not an animal. It was human, and it was hurt. A figure staggered out from behind the water trough, clutching their shoulder, and collapsed into the hay just inside the open barn door. Wyatt moved with the silence of a hunter, his rifle held at the ready. He circled around the back of the barn, using the darkness as a cloak. He slipped inside through a side entrance, the smell of hay and dry earth filling his nostrils. In a moonbeam slanting through the hayloft window, he saw the intruder. It was a woman. Her dark hair was matted with dust and blood, her buckskin dress torn. An arrow shaft protruded from the fleshy part of her shoulder, the wound crudely bandaged. Her features were sharp and intelligent, her heritage clearly a mix of Comanche and something else, something European. She was trying to pull herself to her feet, her jaw set with a fierce, defiant pride. "That's far enough." Wyatt's voice was low, but carried the weight of command. She froze, her head snapping up. Her eyes, dark and piercing, met his. There was no fear in them, only a weary pain and a spark of untamed spirit. "You're Wyatt Cololton," she said, her English perfect and unaccented. It wasn't a question. "You're on my land," he stated, not lowering the rifle. "I need shelter," she replied, her voice strained but steady. "They're hunting me." "Who's they?" Before she could answer, a pained gasp escaped her lips, and she slumped against a support beam, her strength finally giving out. Wyatt hesitated for a heartbeat, then lowered his rifle. Whatever threat she might have posed was secondary to the fact that she was bleeding out in his barn. "Let me see that," he said, kneeling beside her. She flinched as he examined the arrow, but didn't pull away. "It needs to come out." "I know," she gritted out. "I couldn't reach it." Wyatt moved back to the farmhouse and returned with a bottle of whiskey, a clean rag, and a sharp knife. He poured some of the whiskey onto the rag. "This will hurt." "I have endured worse," she said, her gaze unwavering. He broke the arrow shaft, then with a quick, decisive movement, pushed the arrowhead through the other side and pulled the shaft free. She cried out a sharp intake of breath, her fingers digging into the wooden beam. But she did not scream. He quickly cleaned the wound and pressed the whiskey-soaked rag against it, earning another sharp hiss of pain. As he worked, a leather pouch tied to her belt fell open. A bundle of folded papers stained with what looked like her own blood spilled out. He glanced at them, his eyes catching a familiar signature on the top document, Carter Blackwood. "What are these?" he asked, his voice hardening again. She met his gaze. "That is why they hunt me. It is proof. Proof that Blackwood forged the deeds to my people's land. Proof that he ordered the massacre of my village when we refused to leave." The words hung in the air, heavy and deadly. The Johnson Ranch, the Millers' cattle, it all clicked into place. This was the final piece of the puzzle. "My name is Niabi," she said, her voice filled with a cold, contained grief. "My father was a white trader, Thomas Gray. My mother was Comanche. Our village had a legal treaty registered with the territorial government. When my father died, Blackwood came. He offered money. Our elders refused. A week later, they were all gone." She paused, swallowing hard. "I was away trading furs. I came back to find only ashes and ghosts. I found those papers in my father's hidden lockbox. I've been running ever since." Wyatt stared at the papers, then at her. The personal vendetta he'd sworn against Hayes in the bank suddenly broadened into something much larger. This wasn't just about a broken locket anymore. It was about a valley being bled dry by one man's ambition. Protecting this woman and the proof she carried was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. "You brought his war to my doorstep, Niabi," he said, his voice grim. "His war was already here." She countered, her eyes flashing. "You just refused to see it." She was right. He had tried to retreat from the world, to build walls around his grief, but the world had come crashing through them anyway. He looked from her determined, pain-etched face to the papers lying in the hay. The path was clear. He could turn her away, send her back out into the night to face Blackwood's hunters alone, and wait for them to come for him next. Or he could stand and fight. For the first time in 10 years, the choice felt simple. He'll have men combing these hills by morning. Wyatt said, his tone shifting from suspicion to strategy. "We need to be gone before then." He stood and offered her a hand. "Can you ride?" Niabi took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and pulled herself to her feet. "I can ride," she said, a flicker of a grim smile on her lips. "But first, we have uninvited guests." Wyatt followed her gaze. Through the open barn door, silhouetted against the moonlit ridge to the east, he saw them. A dozen riders moving slowly, deliberately, spreading out to surround the ranch. Hayes hadn't waited for morning. He was here to finish the job. Wyatt's hand went to the Colt at his hip. His home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortress under siege. The night air grew cold, heavy with the metallic tang of impending violence. Wyatt moved through the darkness of his ranch yard with the quiet efficiency of a predator. He was no longer just a rancher defending his home. He was a commander preparing a battlefield. "Take the hayloft," he told Niabi, handing her a loaded Henry rifle. "It gives you the best vantage point. Don't fire until I do, and make every shot count." She nodded, the Henry looking natural in her hands. "My father taught me to shoot. He said a woman in this territory needed such skills to survive." "Smart man." Wyatt acknowledged, his eyes scanning the approaching riders. They were dismounting now, fanning out on foot in a practiced flanking maneuver. Professionals. Hayes hadn't brought simple ranch hands. As Wyatt took his position behind a stone water trough, he recognized one of the silhouettes moving with the eerie confidence of a man who knew this kind of work. The way he held his rifle, the way he used the shadows for cover, it was all too familiar. A cold knot tightened in Wyatt's stomach as the man stepped into a patch of moonlight. Sam Wheeler, his former ranger comrade, his friend. The man who had stood by him through a dozen border skirmishes and shared more campfires and bottles of whiskey than he could count. Seeing him among Blackwood's hired guns felt like a deeper betrayal than the shattered locket. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He had set a series of traps earlier in the evening, tripwires connected to shotguns aimed at the main approaches to the house. He waited his breath, held his finger resting lightly on the Winchester's trigger. He let them get closer, let them commit, let them walk deep into the kill zone. When the lead men were within 20 yards of the porch, Wyatt fired a single deafening shot into the air. The signal. The night erupted in a cacophony of thunder and flame. 3 of his preset shotguns fired at once, their blasts of buckshot tearing through the darkness. Cries of pain and surprise cut through the air as 3 of Hayes's men were scythed down. The rest scrambled for cover, their disciplined advance shattered into chaos. Wyatt didn't waste the moment. His Winchester began to speak its voice, a deadly rhythmic crack, crack, crack. He wasn't firing wildly into the dark. He was aiming at the muzzle flashes of their return fire, each shot placed with a ranger's deadly precision. From the barn loft, Niabi's Henry joined in its higher-pitched report, adding to the chorus of death. She was a phenomenal shot, her aim as steady and true as she had claimed. Bullets tore through the air, splintering the wooden walls of the farmhouse and pinging off the stone trough. Wyatt moved constantly, firing a few shots from one position before ghosting through the shadows to another, creating the illusion that there were more defenders than just 2. He was a phantom, his movements economical, his purpose lethal. He saw Sam Wheeler moving toward the side of the house, keeping low. A bitter rage welled up in Wyatt. He could have ended it right there, a clean shot from the shadows. But he couldn't. Not Sam. Instead, he saw 2 other men breaking for the barn, trying to flank Niabi's position. "Barn left side," he yelled, hoping she'd hear him over the din. He saw a muzzle flash from the loft, and one of the men crumpled. The other ducked behind a stack of cordwood. The fight had devolved into a series of deadly isolated skirmishes in the dark. It was the kind of fighting Wyatt knew best. Suddenly, a shotgun blast from his right tore a chunk out of the trough, showering him with stone chips. He rolled away, coming up with his Colt in hand, and found himself face to face with one of Hayes's men who had managed to creep up on his flank. The man's eyes widened in surprise as he raised his pistol. Wyatt's Colt barked once. The man fell backward, his surprise frozen on his face for eternity. As the fight raged, Wyatt kept half an eye on Sam Wheeler's movements, and he started to notice things that didn't make sense. He saw Sam take aim at the farmhouse window where Wyatt had been just moments before. The shot went wide, hitting the frame a good 2 feet to the left. A miss was possible, but not from a marksman like Sam, not at that range. A few moments later, as two men prepared to rush the porch, Wyatt heard Sam call out in a low voice, "Hold circle around the back. He's got the front wired." It sounded like a strategic command, but it had the effect of diverting the rush, giving Wyatt precious seconds to reload. Doubt began to creep into Wyatt's certainty. Was it possible? Could Sam be playing a different game? The thought was cut short as Jackson Hayes himself stepped out from behind the smokehouse, a pair of revolvers in his hands. He moved with an aristocrat's disdain for the chaos around him, his eyes scanning for Wyatt. "Cololton," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the gunfire. "You can't win. Give me the girl and the papers and I'll let you walk away." "You're a liar," Hayes Wyatt shouted back from the cover of a woodpile. Perhaps Hayes laughed, a chilling, humorless sound. "But you'll be a dead man. Your choice." He fired both pistols toward Wyatt's position, the bullets thudding into the logs just inches from his head. The battle reached its bloody crescendo. Wyatt knew they couldn't hold out for much longer. They were low on ammunition, and Hayes's remaining men were closing in, their circle tightening. He had to risk it. He had to trust the flicker of doubt he had about Sam. He broke from cover, sprinting toward the rear of the property where the fence line met a shallow wooded ravine. It was his only escape route. As he ran, he saw Sam Wheeler raise his rifle, drawing a clear bead on his back. This was it. The moment of truth. Wyatt braced for the impact. The rifle cracked, but the bullet didn't hit him. Instead, it struck the dirt at the feet of another of Hayes's men, who was about to cut Wyatt off, causing the man to stumble and giving Wyatt the opening he needed. It was deliberate. It was a warning. It was a signal. Wyatt reached the ravine and plunged into the darkness of the trees. He glanced back to see Nyabi having slipped out the back of the barn, following close behind. The sounds of gunfire began to fade as they put distance between themselves and the ranch. In the chaos, Wyatt saw one last strange tableau: Sam Wheeler appearing to trip and fall, knocking over the man next to him and disrupting the pursuit just long enough for them to get away clean. His ranch was lost, perhaps forever, the air behind him thick with the smell of gunpowder and the ghosts of new violence. But he was alive. Nyabi was alive, and the papers were safe. Most importantly, he carried with him a dangerous, fragile new hope that he wasn't entirely alone in this fight. The sun rose on a landscape bleached to the color of bone. Wyatt Nyabi, and now Sam Wheeler, rode east, their horses kicking up plumes of dust that hung in the still morning air. They had met up at a prearranged rendezvous point, an old line shack Wyatt had used during roundups a few miles from the ranch. The reunion had been tense. Wyatt had his colt trained on Sam before his old friend had even dismounted. "Start talking." Wyatt had said, his voice flat and cold. "And it better be the truth." "It's not what you think, Wyatt." Sam insisted, holding his hands up. "I'm working for Governor Koch, undercover. I've been inside Blackwood's operation for 6 months." He reached slowly into his boot and pulled out a folded, sweat-stained letter bearing the governor's official seal. Wyatt took the letter, his eyes never leaving Sam's, while Nyabi stood by her hand, resting on the knife at her belt. The letter was authentic. It detailed an executive mandate for an undercover investigation into land acquisition practices by the Transcontinental Railroad Company, specifically naming Carter Blackwood. It authorized Special Investigator Sam Wheeler to use any means necessary to gather evidence. Wyatt slowly lowered his gun. "You took a hell of a risk, Sam. I almost shot you." I was counting on you being a better shot than me, Sam said with a half smile. I knew you'd notice my misses. He looked at Niabi, his expression turning serious. The governor knew Blackwood was grabbing land, but we couldn't prove the violence. Your testimony in those papers? They're the key. And so the three of them rode together, an unlikely alliance forged in gunpowder and desperation. Their destination was Redemption Creek. Their goal to reach Judge Hamilton, an old, incorruptible circuit judge known for his fairness, who was due to arrive in town to preside over the territorial court. The journey was a tense, grueling affair. They traveled through jagged canyons and across sun-blasted plains, constantly watching their back trail. Blackwood's reach was long, his network of spies and paid men extensive. Every distant dust cloud, every lone rider was a potential threat. During a brief rest in the shade of a rock outcropping, Niabi tended to her wound, which was inflamed and painful. She spoke little, but her eyes were constantly observing, assessing. She watched the easy camaraderie that still existed between Wyatt and Sam, the shorthand of old partners. You were rangers together for a long time. She stated more an observation than a question. 5 years. Sam confirmed, cleaning his rifle. Wyatt here taught me everything I know about tracking. He could follow a whisper of wind across solid rock. Wyatt ignored the compliment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He was wrestling with his own demons. Sam's presence had brought the past back with a vengeance. He saw flashes of old battles of shared laughter, and then, inevitably, the face of the boy in the border town, the ghost that had driven him from the law. Why did you leave the Rangers, Wyatt? Niabi asked quietly, as if sensing his thoughts. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Sam glanced at him, then looked away, a silent acknowledgement of a painful subject. I wasn't cut out for it anymore, Wyatt said evasively. That's not what I heard, Sam interjected softly. I heard you were the best there ever was, until the Dolan pursuit. The name hung in the air. Wyatt turned a cold stare on him. We don't talk about that. Maybe you should, Niabi said, her voice gentle but firm. A burden carried alone only grows heavier. Wyatt fell silent, the memory of the grieving father's eyes burning in his mind. Blackwood's obsession with his land, Hayes's personal cruelty, it all felt connected somehow to that old failure. He felt like a man caught in a storm of his own making. As they neared Redemption Creek, they saw the evidence of Blackwood's tightening grip. They passed a small homestead, its fences torn down, its well-fouled, a hastily painted "For Sale" sign nailed to the door. Further on, they encountered a freight wagon driver who warned them that Blackwood's men, led by a corrupt federal marshal named Davis, had set up checkpoints on the main roads into town. Blackwood's not just trying to control the land, Sam said grimly. He's trying to control the law itself. He wants to have Niabi officially declared a fugitive before she can ever reach the judge. Their plan to simply ride into town and present the evidence was no longer viable. They were being hunted not just by outlaws, but by men wearing badges. They were fugitives in a territory that was rapidly becoming Carter Blackwood's private kingdom. They found themselves cornered at an abandoned way station, a crumbling adobe relic from the old stagecoach days. A posse led by Marshal Davis himself had picked up their trail. The setting sun cast long, ominous shadows as the riders appeared on the horizon. They've got us boxed in, Sam said, peering through a crack in the wall. At least 20 of them. There's an old storm cellar under the floorboards. Wyatt said, his mind already working the angles. We can hold out there, but not for long. The tension inside the small room was thick enough to cut with a knife. This was the moment of reckoning. Their journey was over. The fight was here and now. So this is it. Nyabi said, her voice calm despite the circumstances. She held the packet of papers in her hand. All this for a piece of paper. It's more than that. Wyatt set his gaze meeting hers. It's for your people. It's for the Johnsons. It's so no one else has to end up like them. Suddenly, Sam held up a hand. Wait, I have an idea. It's a long shot. He pulled a small mirror from his saddlebag. The railroad telegraph line runs about a half-mile north of here. If I can get to that ridge without being seen, I might be able to signal the real federal marshals in the next county. Governor Koch had them on standby just in case. They'll cut you down before you get 50 yards, Wyatt argued. Not if you give them a good enough distraction. Sam countered, a determined glint in his eye. You and Nyabi make them think you're digging in for a siege here. I'll slip out the back. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. As the posse began to surround the station, Wyatt and Nyabi started firing their shots, carefully placed to keep the attackers' heads down. Under the cover of the gunfire and the deepening twilight, Sam slipped out a rear window and disappeared into the scrub brush like a ghost. The siege began in earnest. Marshal Davis's voice boomed across the darkening landscape. In the name of the law, Wyatt Cololton, you are harboring a wanted fugitive. Throw down your weapons and come out. The only fugitive I see is the man taking Blackwood's money, Wyatt yelled back. Gunfire erupted from all sides, chewing away at the adobe walls. Inside, Wyatt and Nyabi moved from window to window, returning fire, conserving their ammunition, making their 2 guns sound like 10. They fought back-to-back, a seamless and deadly team. He was the seasoned tactician, she the patient hunter. In the heat of the battle, a bond of profound respect was forged between them. Hours crawled by. The moon rose, bathing the scene in a ghostly silver light. Their ammunition was running dangerously low. The posse was growing bolder, creeping closer under the cover of darkness. Wyatt knew they couldn't hold out much longer. He wondered if Sam had made it, or if his friend's body was lying somewhere out in the brush. Then, just as a group of deputies prepared for a final overwhelming rush, a new sound split the night, the thunder of a dozen horses approaching at a full gallop from the east. For a terrifying moment, Wyatt thought they were more of Blackwood's reinforcements. A voice roared through the night, a voice of pure, undiluted authority. Federal marshals, drop your weapons. You're all under arrest. A line of riders swept over the ridge, their badges gleaming in the moonlight. They were the real law, led by a grizzled, legendary marshal named Frank Travers. Sam had made it. The posse, caught between the station and the arriving marshals, threw down their guns in confusion and surrender. Wyatt and Nyabi staggered out of the way station, smoke-stained and exhausted, into the sudden blessed quiet. Sam rode up to them, a wide grin on his face. Told you it was a long shot, he said. Marshal Travers dismounted, his stern gaze taking in the scene. Sam Wheeler, you've caused a hell of a lot of trouble. He looked at Wyatt and Nyabi, then at the captured deputies. And it looks like it was worth it. He turned his attention to the now cowering Marshal Davis. You're a disgrace to that badge, Davis. You're going to hang for this. Their ordeal seemed to be over, but as they stood in the aftermath of the siege, a lone rider approached from the direction of Redemption Creek. It was one of the honest deputies from the town, Marshal Travers. He called out, his voice laced with panic. It's Jackson Hayes. He and his men rode out of town an hour ago. They've got the girl. Wyatt's blood ran cold. What girl? The deputy's eyes were wide with fear. Judge Hamilton's daughter, Sarah. She was visiting him at the hotel. Hayes took her. He left a message. He's taking her to Blackwood's new railroad depot out in the basin. He says if anyone follows, she dies. The victory had turned to ash in their mouths. Blackwood had made his final, most vicious move. He hadn't just taken a hostage. He had taken a girl with the same name as Wyatt's late wife, a cruel personal twist of the knife aimed directly at him. And he had taken her to the one place where he held all the power, his unfinished fortress of steel and iron. A brutal, unnatural wind howled out of the west, carrying with it a wall of sand that scoured the land and blotted out the stars. The sandstorm, a roiling beast of grit and fury, descended upon the basin, turning the world into a maelstrom of brown chaos. It was inside this storm, in the skeletal, half-constructed railroad depot, that Carter Blackwood intended to consecrate his empire with blood. Wyatt Sam and Marshal Travers's small band of lawmen rode into the teeth of the gale. The sand stung their faces like 1,000 tiny needles, and visibility was reduced to mere feet. The skeletal frame of the depot emerged from the swirling dust like the rib cage of some colossal dead creature. Lanterns swayed violently, inside casting wild dancing shadows. "My men and I will circle and form a perimeter," Travers yelled over the roar of the wind. "But in this storm, we can't risk a direct assault. We'd be shooting blind. Wyatt, Sam, you two know these men. You go in. Find the girl. We'll be ready to move in on your signal." Wyatt knotted his face a grim mask. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, his eyes narrowed against the stinging sand. This was more than a rescue. This was a reckoning. He dismounted his Winchester in his hand and exchanged a look with Sam. No words were needed. They moved toward the depot, two ghosts swallowed by the storm. Inside the depot was a chaotic maze of stacked timber rails and construction materials. The wind shrieked through the open walls, kicking up dust and debris. At the center of the vast open space, Jackson Hayes stood with a cruel smile on his face. He held Judge Hamilton's daughter, a terrified young woman named Sarah, with a knife to her throat. Standing on a raised platform above them, like a king surveying his domain, was Carter Blackwood. "O'Connellton." Blackwood's voice was a resonant boom, easily carrying over the storm. "I knew you would come, a man of such predictable honor." "Let the girl go, Blackwood." Wyatt called out from the shadows. "Your fight is with me." Blackwood chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "My fight? Oh, you still don't understand, do you? You think this is about land, about a railroad?" He stepped forward into the lantern light, and for the first time, Wyatt saw the profound, bottomless grief etched into the man's features. The arrogance was a facade, a shell built around an ancient, festering wound. "This is about my son," Blackwood said, his voice cracking with a pain that was decades old. "My boy Thomas. He was 17, a good boy. He was visiting his aunt in a little border town called Tres Lomas. He went to the general store to buy his mother a birthday gift." Wyatt froze. Tres Lomas, the Dolan gang. The name of the town hit him like a physical blow. The ghost he had been running from for 10 years had finally caught him. "You and your rangers rode into town that day." Blackwood continued, his voice thick with venom and sorrow. "You started a war in the street, bullets flying everywhere. And my son, my innocent boy, was caught in the crossfire. He died on the dusty street holding a silver music box he had bought for his mother." The world seemed to tilt under Wyatt's feet. The faceless boy from his nightmares suddenly had a name: Thomas Blackwood. And the grieving father, the merchant whose hatred had seared Wyatt's soul, was the man standing before him. I watched him die, Cololton. Blackwood whispered, his composure finally breaking. I held him, and I swore an oath on his body. I swore I would build an empire so powerful, so vast, that I would have the strength to take everything from the man who took everything from me. I didn't build this railroad to connect the country. I built it to destroy you, to ruin your life, to take your land, to salt the earth of your memories, just as you did to mine. The revelation was staggering. It wasn't greed. It was revenge. A vast, intricate, all-consuming obsession born from a father's grief. It was a tragedy. Wyatt set his own voice hoarse with a guilt he could no longer deny. I live with it every day. You live, Blackwood roared. My son doesn't. Now you will watch as I take something from another man of the law. A beautiful daughter named Sarah. The poetry of it is magnificent, don't you think? He nodded to Hayes. Kill her. As Hayes tightened his grip, Sam opened fire from his hidden position, his shot striking the lantern above Hayes's head. The depot was plunged into near-total darkness, pierced only by the swirling dust caught in the occasional flash of distant lightning. Chaos erupted. Find them! Blackwood shrieked. What followed was a desperate blind ballet of violence. A cat-and-mouse game played out in the howling darkness and swirling sand. Wyatt used his ranger skills, moving silently through the skeletal structure, the storm his ally. He could hear Hayes's men stumbling, disoriented, their shots firing wildly. Wyatt came upon one of them, disarmed him in the dark, and laid him out with a single brutal punch. He found another stalking Sam and took him down from behind. The storm was his element. The darkness was his friend. He finally located Hayes, who was using the terrified Sarah as a shield. Nowhere left to run, Ranger. Hayes sneered, his voice tight with tension. I'm not running. Wyatt's voice came from a direction Hayes wasn't expecting. As Hayes turned, Wyatt lunged from the shadows. He tackled Hayes, driving him away from the girl. Sarah scrambled away into the darkness as the two men crashed to the ground. Their fight was brutal and personal. It was not a gunfight, but a desperate rolling brawl in the dirt and sand. Fists, knees, elbows. It was fueled by Wyatt's cold rage over the locket and Hayes's sadistic cruelty. Hayes was strong, but Wyatt was driven by a decade of repressed grief and a fury that had finally been unleashed. He gained the upper hand, his hands closing around Hayes's throat. This is for her. Wyatt rasped the wind, whipping the words away. He slammed Hayes's head against a steel rail, once, twice. Hayes went limp. It was over. Wyatt staggered to his feet, breathing heavily. He saw Sam helping Sarah to safety. But the climax wasn't over. On the platform, Carter Blackwood stood alone, a single, elegant revolver in his hand, aimed at Wyatt. You took my son. Blackwood said, his voice eerily calm amidst the storm. Now I will take you. I am sorry for your son, Blackwood. Wyatt set his own Colt now in his hand. More than you will ever know. But this won't bring him back. Where Blackwood agreed, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. But it will finally bring me peace. He cocked the hammer. Before he could fire, a shot rang out, not from Wyatt's gun, but from outside. Blackwood shuddered, a look of surprise on his face. He looked down at the red stain spreading across his pristine white shirt. He had stepped in front of an open section of the wall, silhouetted for a split second by a flash of lightning. It was all Marshal Travers had needed. Blackwood collapsed to his knees, his gun clattering to the floor. He looked at Wyatt, his eyes no longer filled with hatred, but with a vast, empty weariness. It was all for nothing, he whispered. Then he slumped forward, his quest for revenge finally at its end. As if on cue, the fury of the sandstorm began to subside. The howling wind softened to a mournful sigh, and the blinding curtain of dust thinned, revealing a sky bruised with the first pale hints of dawn. The depot was quiet now, save for the moans of the wounded and the whisper of the dying wind. Marshal Travers and his men moved in, securing the scene with grim efficiency. They found Carter Blackwood alive, though barely. A doctor was summoned not out of mercy, but so that he could stand trial for his crimes. Jackson Hayes was dead. His reign of terror was over. Wyatt stood over Blackwood, who was being tended to by one of the marshals. The railroad baron's eyes fluttered open and met Wyatt's. The fire of vengeance was gone, replaced by the hollow emptiness of a man who had lost everything twice. "Did you know?" Blackwood rasped, his voice a fragile thread. His name was Thomas. He loved to draw horses. Wyatt could only nod, a lump forming in his throat. He was a lawman, a killer, a survivor. But in that moment he was also the man who had stood over the body of a 17-year-old boy in Tres Lomas, a boy who loved to draw horses. Blackwood's confession had not absolved Wyatt. It had forced him to finally confront the full weight of his own past. He had not pulled the trigger, but he had led the charge. He had brought the storm to that peaceful town. He had played a part in the tragedy that had created this monster, and it was a truth he would have to carry forever. Sam clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did what you had to do, Wyatt. All of it." Wyatt looked at his friend, then at Nyabi, who was standing nearby, her gaze steady and understanding. He saw Sarah Judge Hamilton's daughter being comforted by her father, who had arrived with the marshals. He saw the lives that had been saved, the reign of terror that had been ended. It wasn't a victory that could be celebrated. It was a wound that could finally begin to heal. He walked away from the depot out into the clean, storm-washed air of the new morning. He looked east toward his ranch, his home. He knew that rebuilding the fences and the barn would be the easy part. Rebuilding the men who lived there would be a much harder job. Months later, peace had settled over the valley like a soft, welcome rain. The autumn sun cast a gentle golden light on the plains. Carter Blackwood had been tried and sentenced to life in the territorial prison where he died a few years later, a broken man haunted by the ghost of his son. The Transcontinental Railroad still came through, but under new federal oversight. Land was purchased fairly, and the town of Redemption Creek began to grow. This time around a foundation of law, not fear. Sam Wheeler, true to his word, had been promoted. He was now the governor's chief investigator for the entire Western Territory, a man whose name was synonymous with justice. He wrote to Wyatt occasionally, letters filled with news of a changing world, always ending with an open offer of a badge should Wyatt ever want one again. Wyatt always politely declined. The Double C Ranch was whole again. The fences were mended, the barn rebuilt. But it was no longer a place of solitary remembrance. Next to it, on the land legally secured for her people, was a new settlement. Nyabi had become a leader, guiding the remnants of her tribe in building a new life. The two properties existed side by side, a partnership of mutual respect and shared survival. They were not just neighbors. They were allies, their futures intertwined. One cool evening, Wyatt stood inside his quiet home. The air no longer felt heavy with loss. It felt calm, expectant. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket. He had taken the shattered pieces to the blacksmith in town, a quiet, skilled man who had painstakingly repaired it. A fine silver seam now traced its way across the casing, a scar that did not hide the damage, but incorporated it into a new kind of wholeness. He opened it. The blacksmith had been unable to save the portrait, so Wyatt had replaced it with a tiny pressed bluebonnet, Sarah's favorite flower, a symbol not of a face, but of a memory. He walked to the mantelpiece. With a steady hand, he placed the repaired locket where it had always belonged. It looked right. It felt right. Then he took a single perfect eagle feather, a gift from Nairobi, a symbol of strength, honor, and vision, and placed it gently on the mantel next to the locket. The tarnished silver and the proud feather sat together in the warm lamplight. One represented a past he would always honor, a love that had shaped him. The other represented a future he was finally ready to embrace, a partnership built on shared ground and hard-won peace. It was a quiet promise that healing was not about forgetting, but about making room for a new life, to grow alongside the old. For the first time in a decade, Wyatt Cololton felt a sense of hope, a quiet, earned sense of peace.